Now, Karl Marx, when he discussed the idea about communism, didn't really write much about transitional society. And we have actually, in the last 100 years, accumulated an enormous amount of information and experience, positive and negative, on the ideas, concepts and practices of transitional societies, whether it be in the Soviet Union or China or Cuba, or even countries where social democracy intervened heavily to ameliorate the worst elements of capitalism, like Britain, Sweden, France, Germany, and so on. So we do have an enormous amount of experience which allows us, knowledge, which allows us to assess what alternative methodologies should be applied in a transitional economy moving from capitalism to socialism. Well, first you must identify what economic entities do dominate the economy. So really they'd have to look perhaps at the stock market and shares market and look at which the biggest companies are and which have the most influence on the number of employees, on the investment decisions, on the everyday impact upon society, on the environment, upon transportation, upon healthcare, education and so on. Take what we consider to be, as a society, what is necessary to control for the interests of the population, and then expropriate them. Now there can be different ways of doing that. Once you've transferred these big companies and banks into public ownership, how do you continue to expand that public sector and make it efficient? Efficient in the sense that Engels said in 1847 in his pamphlet The Principles of Communism, efficient such that you out-compete the capitalist competition. That's the question. How does the public sector out-compete the private sector? Now there are two ways I believe you do this. One is through establishing mechanisms of democratic control which allow greater inputs of skill, knowledge, energy and creativity through harnessing the latent energies and abilities of the workforce and of the consumer of the goods produced by the workforce through democratic structures of planning the administrative and productive and material design of goods and the use and variation of the goods and the means of disseminating the goods and organising the production process. So once you've worked those type of structures out, which I believe what we call workers' councils, in other words, democratically administered management and elected management by the workforce. So if the management doesn't do the policies that the workforce want, then they can be removed, enabling and facilitating the use of creativity and public ownership of the commanding heights and the mechanism of transferring the balance of power such that the biggest industries and sections of the economy are publicly owned and acquire capital from capitalism. In other words, they are able to outstrip capitalist operations. The other way you can do it is to systematically favour the public sector. For example, if you have railways transporting goods around the country, in England there's not too much of that anymore, but where you have that, railways transporting goods around the country, the way in which you can favour the public sector is to make a pricing system, for example, serve the public rather than the private. So for example, if a private newspaper like Rupert Murdoch's Times newspaper wants to distribute their newspapers by train from London to Glasgow, sending 30,000 newspapers to Glasgow, what we can do is charge Rupert Murdoch more money to transport his coachload of newspapers to Scotland, so much more money for his carriage to transport the newspapers, that we can also transport baby milk paid for by the public sector to be distributed for free in Edinburgh or Glasgow to women in need who are unable to pay for it, paid for by the charge we levy on Rupert Murdoch's newspapers going on the train. And in that way, the public sector can be used to redistribute wealth from the private sector to the public sector. In the People's Republic of China, over the last 20 years, they gradually allowed the postal services to be run by different companies. DHL went in there, I believe some British companies went in there, FedEx went in there, and this year, the Chinese government decided they would no longer allow that. And so what they did was, they nationalized the entire postal services in China, such that you're only allowed to distribute or send goods in weight over 50 grams via the state. And in this way, they acquire the capital, the private money that would have been spent on FedEx and the rest of these services now gets paid to the state. If you elect workers' council, if you're a government run by workers' councils, or better said, if the administration of the commanding heights of the economy is run by workers' councils and checked and controlled by the consumer, which is the general population, of course, then there must be some forms of administrative hierarchy established. It's not to create a society without any hierarchical structure whatsoever. Otherwise, no decision would ever get made. What we're saying is, if you elect a structure of, let's say, a workers' council of 10, they can decide not only either to administer the company themselves, but also to appoint Daniel here to administer on their behalf. They could decide to appoint a committee of 50 people to administer on their behalf.
That's certainly the case.
That's his argument, sir.
What you're talking about now.
Hang on. Was that the argument you were asking
Well,
about?
again, you're saying 10 people can do this, 50 can do that. Again, you're creating cells, differences.
Certainly are.
So there's-
Certainly are.
That's the
But
concept.
cells based upon democratic control and administration and recallability to those people who elected them, and which are serving the public and not the private sector. That's the argument.
This argument is circular because we're talking about the transition to socialism.
That's right.
And so what you say is that you take things from the private sector, accumulate into the public sector.
That's correct.
But your solution for doing this is having a country that's run by workers' councils, by Soviets.
That's
so in
correct.
that case, the transition's already been made.
As I said,
if the people in the country are
no.
in running it from Soviets, then that's been done.
No,
you need a state the state has a monopoly on violence. That's true. That's a fact. Now, they're not going to allow wealth to be redistributed in that way unless you own the power of the state.
Well, I don't
or
deny
it's been
that.
abolished.
I don't deny that.
Surely that's the first step then, not accumulating capital from the
I
private
said
sector.
earlier on that I left that question aside, the question of the state, because that is a question about revolution. And I wasn't in particular discussing the question of making a revolution. I was discussing the question of how an economy that is dominated by public ownership can be run efficiently. That was the question I was asking. Because after all, what's the point in making a revolution if you're going to end up with an inefficient system? So first you have to explain to people, at least to some degree, how that system will be run. And that it will be, as the gentleman who asked me earlier on, that it will be more efficient and more productive than capitalism. Otherwise, what's the point in making a revolution, you know?
So
if
what
it ends up like East Germany, what's the point?
What happened to the transition then? Are we not talking about that?
Yes, we're talking about the transition. The transition is not the revolution. The transition is the phase after a revolution where the public sector systematically acquires the resources necessary to provide plenty for all of mankind. And that lays the foundation, according to Marx's concept, for the creation of a communistic order of society.